So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Michelle Maloney and I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the New Economy Network Australia. And you're joining us today for what will probably be a very important discussion about housing as part of our Localisation Week. So just before I introduce our lovely speakers, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Jinnaburra and Gubbi Gubbi people in my newer home now here in Narangba. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and the emerging leaders and custodians who are continuing the remarkable civilizational culture and governance system that Indigenous peoples have had since time immemorial. Inside NENA, we like to acknowledge country, not just as some tokenism, but as a true recognition that the first peoples were on this continent when the colonial project of the British Empire joined this continent. So we acknowledge their solidarity, we acknowledge their sovereignty, and that lands were never ceded. We also like to acknowledge that NENA is really committed to decolonising the way we think and feel and act on this place. My goal as a personal human being is to be a good earthling on this country, and that definitely involves shedding a lot of the things we think we know about modernity and modern society, and learning from Indigenous culture about relationist ethos and how we can care for each other, which is a really nice segue, I think, into this week. The New Economy Network Australia has been around for 5 or 6 years, a beautiful network of amazing people trying to draw attention to the economic system we have and show through their own work and initiatives what a different economic system could look like, one that supports people and planet. This week, we're celebrating Localisation Week, which is an initiative by Local Futures and the Economics of Happiness. Yesterday was the official World Localisation Day, but they've pretty much got events throughout the whole month, and I will put the links in the chat box in a moment. And so we in NENA have had some really important discussions about what shifting towards a more human scale, connected, localized economy can look like. We started with looking at a range of the big picture issues around globalization and corporate control of many of the things we have in our societies, and then looked at how communities are building resilience in the face of the climate change crises we're facing, and also escalating fires and floods. Yesterday, we had an excellent discussion about food systems, and all of those sessions have been recorded, as today's is as well. So today, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our 3 guest speakers to talk about their experiences in looking at the housing crisis in Australia. I'm sure anyone on this call is fully familiar with the dire situation we've found ourselves in, one of the richest nations on earth, struggling to find suitable, affordable, and certainly not sustainable housing for all of its people. I'm going to let my speakers, our speakers, introduce themselves fully because they wear many hats, but we're going to be hearing from Elena PEREYRA, Stephen Lauros, and Matt Daly. So each of these lovely humans will talk to us for about 5-10 minutes about what they're doing, their ideas about housing and localization, and then we'll open up for Q&A. And may I please invite you all to stay on mute unless you're speaking. It just saves any interference in the background. And I really invite you to write any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll collect your questions for the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to take the spotlight off Matt, Steve, and myself, and let us all listen to Elena. Elena, thank you so much for joining us. You had your beanie on before. As a Queenslander, I have this 1 month a year when I can look at your weather and go, wow, that's tough. Because then for the other 6 months of summer, you're all looking up here going, wow, that's tough. But how are you today, doll?
Good, thank you. I'm originally from Queensland, so I suffer in the cold and have a big whinge. And in summer down here, usually a little bit more, composed than the Victorians. So no, it's but yeah,
it's an ongoing challenge. We feel you. We feel you. Well, thanks.
That's right. And I mean, we're getting hotter and hotter and colder all the time. So it's important that we deal with these things now, or the whinging will only get worse.
Absolutely.
So yeah, my background's in architecture, and I was sort of very disappointed with what I was seeing happening in the housing space in particular. And so I became really interested in alternative forms of housing. But I'd like to just start by sort of talking about some fundamental things that people seem, you know, concerned about, like this, and it often comes back to the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. But in the 18th century, these were referred to as reading, reckoning, and we'll see how yeah, just keep me posted. Yeah, and I feel like we've really lost our opportunity to engage in housing in a way that lets us really kind of grapple with how we want to live and the types of housing that we want to make, and also engaging in those processes of design and even construction. Another element that people often talk about is wring their hands about is around financial literacy, and increasingly, especially in niches like this, around eco-literacy. But one of the things that I'm really concerned about is civic literacy, and that we've really lost the occasion and place for the exploration of the relationships between freedom and responsibility, and obligation and sort of choice and agency. And we've lost the opportunity to participate in collaborative decision-making processes, develop interpersonal skills, and create pro-social dynamic governance at a hyper-local level. There's lots of top-down infrastructures in representative democracy, and it's been kind of infiltrated by big business and, in a lot of ways, sort of big social welfare, which both rob us of our agency and often dignity. And so what does all this have to do with housing and localization? I see the creation, development, and stewardship of housing as a key way to support hyperlocal forms of economic exchange, ecological living, and dynamic governance. And there's lots of models that we'll sort of talk about today, I'm sure: eco-villages, intentional communities, co-located co-ops, and co-housing. And these models sort of embed some of those attributes at their kind of core. And in a lot of ways, because they are citizen-led. They're led by the communities that want to live there, and they're led by the values that hold those people together. There's another 3 R's that I'm quite worried about, which is roads, rates, and rubbish. Most people are very dismissive about local government, but I think local government can actually play a huge role in revolutionizing democracy. There's a lot of important innovation that has to happen at the local level, and a lot of that for housing comes down to the planning scheme. But part of the process of engaging with people at this hyperlocal level will be able to facilitate conversations about housing affordability, about mitigating urban sprawl, about adapting urban renewal and existing apartment buildings to allow for electrification, urban agriculture, and other forms of sharing economies. Yeah, the activities need to happen at the local level, and I think that there's lots of opportunities to bring that in through these various models of housing, but also at a broader scale around reimagining the strata and owners corp model as a high functioning and sophisticated form of social infrastructure that can also create new partnerships and opportunities with local government. So, I mean, that's why I'm a massive nerd about co-housing and collaborative and citizen-led housing. And co-housing really allows people to engage deeply with how they want to live and what's important, and it's a place to really develop those collaboration skills and interpersonal skills. And in developing these models, it's an opportunity to engage with local councils and with planning around social infrastructure and community amenity, about planning and urban resilience, but also about new forms of participatory governance, participatory planning, participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, and those sorts of things. And I think cohousing is a kind of, it's such a great instrument that we can leverage for people to develop these skills that are sorely needed and not really facilitated in any other part of our lives. And that's why at cohousing, we're really keen to see one in every suburb, so that these can be really hyper-local examples of people working together and creating solutions. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Elena. And I am really sorry about losing you there on the system. But we'll come back to Elena in a moment. Elena does some amazing work with the co-housing folks. Oh, sorry, I've got my video off too. I was hoping that my system wasn't causing the problem. Elena does some really fantastic work with co-housing and looks across a whole range of innovative solutions to the current housing crises. So we will definitely come back in a moment and chat with Elena further. So thank you, Elena. And Matt, I'm now going to put the spotlight on you. How are you today, Matt?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm good.
Coping with the cold down there. Matt, would you like to share with us, where you're from and what you've been working on, and what your connection to the ideas around localization mean for your work on housing issues?
Yeah, totally. So I'm calling in from Darawal country, which is the Wollongong Illawarra region south of Sydney. And my day job is as a research fellow at the University of Wollongong, working within the Sustainable Building Research Centre, and relevant very much to this discussion. I also kind of convene a researcher network for Cohousing Australia, of people working on different aspects of co-housing, collaborative housing across Australia, which is always great. Hopefully there's a couple of people from that group on the call today. And probably I'd like to give a little bit of background about how I've ended up as a researcher in housing and sustainability space, because it's obviously my parents' fault for all of this. They moved out of Sydney before I was born to the Shoalhaven region and decided they were going to build a mud brick house on a block of land, and went about doing that, sort of the natural building, do-it-yourself approach. But probably really influential from my perspective was they did it as part of a network of muddies who were a bunch of people all around the region who were interested in trying to build their own mud brick house, and formed a bit of a informal community, would get together once a month or so to do working days together to help each other do their house. And through that, that became a big part of my community growing up, in terms of, the people we'd go away on holidays with, we'd go and see each other's houses being built. I mean, I wasn't doing much as a 5-year-old, but watch other people build our houses, and just seeing the way that the home and the community came together, I think has stuck with me throughout my whole life. From there, I've went and studied environmental engineering at university, and then did a PhD looking at sustainability practices in alternative housing communities, so eco villages and kind of co-housing developments. And since then, have worked on a number of research projects around different types of collaborative housing, and trying to understand the space that exists within the Australian housing market and culture, and ways to help kickstart more collaborative housing and help existing groups overcome barriers that they might be facing, and understand, sort of see where the research can help to bring about a co-housing development in every suburb, as Elena said, because I think it's a model of housing that has the potential to address a lot of, or in some way address a lot of the challenges that we face in Australia's, like the cities and regions we have. And just, I thought in my short amount of time, I just highlight what I see as one of the big issues we face and one of the gaps in the housing market at the moment. And Elena mentioned that she talked about how we've lost the element of involvement in design and construction of our housing over the last many years. I'm just going to share my screen quickly to bring up this one image, which I've been looking at recently for some work I'm going to be doing for the Greater City Commission, which is a Sydney-based quasi-governmental organisation. And it just shows very simply the two types of homes, a new house or an existing house on the left-hand side, and then whether it's a detached single freestanding home or a multi-unit dwelling like an apartment or a townhouse on the other side. And kind of the options in the market in Australia at the moment are, if you want a new house, you can go and buy one. It can be from a volume builder, but you still get a lot of customization, or you can go and get an architect and design your own and build it exactly the way you want, or you can find one that exists already. Find one that hopefully, there's a lot of money involved in this and it's getting increasingly hard, but it's an option available. And if you want to buy a multi-unit dwelling, you can go and find one that already exists that suits your needs and buy that. But there's basically no option if you want to have a say in the design and construction and the way a multi-unit dwelling is built. It's not really an option in the Australian housing market. And that means, I think that really ties into the localisation thing, that you can't have a say in the way that your multi-unit dwelling is going to be built in any kind of meaningful way. And what this means is it's those decisions are left to the speculative developers. And there's a quote from a researcher that said that market-led urban development will provide the cities Australians want, is sort of the neoliberal view of the market at the moment. But what it actually does is leads to housing outcomes informed by profit and politics rather than ways to achieve a more socially, environmentally or equitable city. And researchers have looked at this and said that, the speculative supply-led housing results in a market that's slow to innovate, it's conservative, it's risk-averse, and it gives us a poor quality product most of the time. And you can see that in many cities. You get a lot of 1- and 2-bedroom apartments developed for maximum profit to the developer and maximum profit to the investor, who almost all the time is the one who buys those apartments. And I think there's a real problem in the market, and finding ways to get people who live in an area to be able to have a say and participate in the development of higher density buildings, because that's like a way that things are going. And I think it's a gap that it works. But a way to get residents to have a say in the places they're going to live in the future is a missing part of housing in Australia. And that's where a lot of the work I've been doing and some of my interests it could be summarized in that slide there. I'll stop sharing and might just leave it at that. That's my initial thoughts, and pass it over to Michelle and Stephen.
Thank you so much, Matt. And again, we'll come back in a moment and have chats with you. So I am going to bring Steve into the spotlight. Steve Lowris, thank you so much for joining us. I can see that you're probably in your mobile home at the moment, cruising around doing good deeds, trying to change the housing system. Did you want to share with us your thoughts on localisation and the work you're doing around housing?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So I'm a strategic town planner. I might share screen. I've got a presentation I'd like to share. Like Elena, working as a strategic town planner, getting involved in apartment buildings and particularly greenfield housing estates, which was basically just a sea of roofs. I also became disillusioned with the way the system is, and even speaking with developers, seeing that the system isn't really working for anyone, not the developers, in fact, and not certainly not for communities and creating social and environmentally sustainable outcomes. So started looking at, what are the cutting edge ideas and what are communities trying to build in. So we did a lot of research in Europe and then around Australia in this motorhome. We're actually back at home now, but we're just doing some renovations. So there was a bit of noise, so I came out in the van. So as I said, my background's what I do is strategic town planning, but my doctorate is in political economy, and particularly how the circular economy can reshape cities and settlement patterns. And this presentation, I want to connect the kind of the three themes that are covered off here. That is localization, housing, and the new economy. So how do we connect those three ideas? And my starting point is this idea that we tend to think of the various issues, like deal with the pandemic separately to dealing with climate change, separately to housing affordability. They're all separate issues that seem to we believe have separate responses, but I see them all as symptoms of a systemic crisis, and this is not new to people in the new economy space. And essentially, what I'd argue is we need a new operating system, a new economic system. So a lot of people are thinking of, what is that new economic system? Now, in addition to these crises or issues being dealt with separately, the solutions we're coming up with are also arriving separately because they're addressing different issues. And my position has been and continues to be that the solutions are all there. We just need to put them together in a place and show a different way of building an economic system, and thinking of the economic system not as an abstraction. It's not a spreadsheet. It's about how we organize ourselves to satisfy our needs and wants. And that happens in place, in geography. It's a spatial problem, how we organize our built environment, the housing in relation to work activities, in relation to the environment, so on. The perspective I approach this from is the circular economy. And these are the three generally agreed principles now of the circular economy: eliminate waste and pollution, circulate resources and products continuously, and regenerate nature, all by design. So create a design system that does all those three things. But a lot of the people in that circular economy space still see our economy as a global system. And this kind of movement of resources across the planet in this way is one of the critical problems, that we already know that 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, are scope 3 emissions, which is supply chain emissions. And the only way we can really strive towards elimination of waste and pollution is to localize. So the circular economy really should be seen as a network of local circular economies. And once we see that perspective, then we can appreciate the Indigenous view of the world, that is a distributed network of local circular or regenerative economies. There's no centre. This idea of centralising populations in, the capital cities, where we currently have 50% of Australia's population in 3 cities, is the problem, that we need to distribute the populations across the continent, because keeping people contained, people seem to think that keeping people contained in major cities minimises the impact on the environment. But it's actually the opposite. The impact of the cities on rural areas, on the environment, and the extraction of resources and food in this kind of industrial manner has a huge impact on the areas outside the cities. So distributing our housing in this way is of critical importance. So what we're talking about is the creation of these circular neighbourhoods where we localise housing with the production. And when I have this little factory here for production, I'm not talking about mass industrial production. I'm talking about the production of energy, water and food in association with our housing. And any products that need to be made should be used. We now have these technologies of 3D printers and waste to resource microfactories. So we keep using the same materials to produce the new products that we need locally, as close as possible to the housing as possible. And so this systems approach brings us to this idea of an infrastructure ecosystem that integrates energy, water, food, transport, housing, and other buildings. So, an energy microgrid, renewable energy microgrid, can help circulate water and clean water. It can power electric vehicles. The water irrigates the agriculture. The agriculture provides food and manages organic waste. And so all of these things become more efficient and therefore less costly if they're integrated, and the waste of one feeds into or becomes an input to another system. So when we're talking about creating a local circular economy, I use the term circular economy because that's the narrative that has popular traction now, that we can actually work with people who are looking for a new economy. Even in government and mainstream corporate environments, they're talking about a circular economy. But ultimately, that's a regenerative economy because that's one of the principles of a circular economy. It's also a steady state economy because you're circulating the same resources within that place. And this is the original book by Herman Daly from 1974. You can see the price of it. Interesting price, $3.95 at the top there. But it's about circulating resources in place. So it's exactly aligned with the principles of a steady state economy, also aligned with the ideas of a donut economy and a gift economy, because when you have an abundance of basic needs, you have an oversupply relative to demand, the price goes towards zero. So those basic necessities should be free, should be available freely within this kind of collaborative community. And we're working towards a pilot project in Bellingen, setting up the planning framework for one of these villages, 40 hectares, 200 people, with all these systems integrated. And really what we're trying to demonstrate is when you put the housing in this urban zone, there is an impact outside of that. So let's manage that impact and regenerate natural systems and leave land for wildlife within the system that we're creating. Yes, and so just some images prepared by an architect. So we're talking about a chain of ponds along a gully. So that's not a river running through it. It's a constructed creek line with a chain of ponds that provide the water system for the village, and the housing embedded in the landscape with green roofs and so on. And there's a lot more information at our website there, polisplan.com.au. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Steve. A really fantastic vision. And after seeing your work, seeing you and Nil work so hard on these issues, seeing the project start to come together in Bellingen is really exciting, and can't wait to watch or be part of how it all starts to ravel up, how it all starts to come together. No, with the unraveling. All right, I am going to bring everyone back into Spotlight. Although, Elena, would you like to share your video again? And then we can have a bit of a chat. There are some comments. I'll read through them. We've got more comments and questions, actually. So what I might do, there we go. Hello, Elena, I'll bring you in. Fabulous. So I might open the conversation, but then I'd really love for Steve, Matt, Elena, for you to chat about issues that you think are relevant to the localization theme, because for those who don't know, NENA has a variety of different sectoral hubs, as well as a deep interest in systems change. And the NENA Housing Hub hosts a NENA Housing Week, although I think we call ourselves Human Habitats now. And if you're interested, there are some excellent recordings of all of the talks different folks gave last year and the year before. So just really want to urge you to check out some of the other folks connected to the Housing Hub. But my first question for all three of you is, given the attention at the moment is on the affordability and accessibility of rentals and ownership of houses in Australia, does the idea of localisation, I mean, let's get real here, does localising housing supply or housing stock or housing developers, will that make any difference to the affordability issue? And maybe we want to talk first about why are houses so crazy expensive in Australia? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, I can talk to why housing is so crazy expensive.
Yes.
Because every step of the process is about extracting value from all the participants in that process. So, for example, when the land is rezoned from rural to urban, whoever happens to own it at that time gets this massive value uplift that is just, just granted. And so, an acre of rural land is $15,000, but, you could fit, I don't know the number, but, a single plot, 450 square meter plot then has a value of, $180,000. So that value uplift is a huge component of it. Financing costs are extraordinary, in the order of 10 to 15% for speculative development. And then, the construction costs, we all have seen how they've exploded in recent years, but they have always been high. So every part of that delivery process is about, the finance people, the land rezoning process. Everyone takes value away out of it, and so you have these escalating prices. And on top of that, there's this cultural narrative of the great Australian dream, where everyone thinks ownership is ultimately the only way in which you can, live a prosperous life in Australia.
Thank you, Steve. Elena, Matt, what are your thoughts? Why is everything so crazy expensive? It's a very technical question, as you can tell.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good summary of why everything's so expensive. And I mean, just kind of doing things locally with a local group doesn't kind of just instantly make them cheaper, because land is so expensive, because you still have to fight with the availability of materials and potentially skilled labor. Construction and land is just expensive. So even if you have elements of resource sharing, you can limit your requirements around appliances and certain spaces that we usually have individually in our own houses, like the spare bedroom and things like that. You can have a couple of guest rooms co-located. So there's opportunities for some savings, but then you have to input that into the shared spaces anyway, because that's what helps hold the community together. So I think it's not just a easy exchange that the options are going to be cheaper in the long-term experience. Oh, am I phasing out again? The life in the lifestyle and kind of life cycle of the communities. But I mean, I feel like the biggest opportunity is to really start to deeply engage in that governance space at a local level around having these conversations, because I think it's really hard to have them when it comes to a state or a national conversation, because it comes down to kind of really abstracted ideas around taxation and things like that. And people, it's easy to kind of manipulate the conversation and get people really kind of scared about what it means for them. But I think at a super local level, you can have really caring conversations around housing affordability and key workers and things that are really tangible, and that local exchange of resources and skills and support, and just supporting other people who are your neighbours. And that's where I think there's a lot of potential for community land trusts and co-ops to come in, where the land and the assets can be a resource that is co-owned and co-stewarded by the residents that live there and the local neighbourhood, where rents can be paid or reduced to accommodate people's capacities, and the profits can be returned into the local neighbourhood. I mean, I think that's where we can start to see a kind of ripple effect around affordability. But the problem is that you can't just have one, you need to have multiple all over the place.
Thanks. And Matt, what are your thoughts?
Well, the more I get into this space, the more I realize I came as an engineer into housing market dynamics, and probably need a PhD in economics to really understand it all and feel more and more out of my depth. But with that caveat, I think like a big thing is, and I kind of touched on it, right? If there's a place, a bit of land going, or something, a site that could be built on to create a co-housing community or something, some awesome locally generated, really socially and environmentally sustainable style housing development, but some other developer says I can make more money by building the same 1 and 2 bedroom units that I built down the road and selling them to investors from all over the place who are never going to live in there, then they'll come in, buy the land and do that. And that's where the price is being set, is not on what's good housing, but what makes money for people who have the money to throw down. And so that's sort of, you know, like there's lots of things going on there, but that's also one of the factors.
Yeah, the structural imbalances. Yeah. And one of the reasons I mentioned the NENA webinars that are all recorded and all onto the website is we had quite a large discussion, didn't we, last year in the Housing Week about the financial system, the financial structures, and how to break some of that down. So I do urge some of you to have a look at that. And I also want to mention Louise Crabtree-Hayes gives this brilliant talk about how the very notion of time and progress in Western societies underpins this idea that we expect land to be worth more in a few years' time. Whereas if you think about other cultures, land was land, it was home, it was sacred. It didn't have to become more valuable in the future to be more valuable. It was the thing that provided, the thing that is our home, and it's not a thing at all. So I just being cheeky, want to refer people to having a look at that, because pulling apart the ideas of why life is so expensive and why housing is expected to continually go up. I think, to me, this is part of the root problem of the Western construct of home, how we can live, what should we do to make life more affordable, when there's some really basic truths if you sort of decolonize that Western thinking. But back to a more practical way of thinking about these issues, perhaps we can talk about, I mean, what I hear a lot of as someone like you, Matt, who's not an economist and not, you know, confident to talk about how these issues work. I'm the person facilitating the conversations because I want to hear other people's suggestions and ideas. So I'd love your thoughts on, if we're looking at localization, and I think Elena particularly touched on this idea of having those community conversations and pulling apart how things are planned and permitted for, but also the financial structures. Did you, Steve, or one of you want to talk about how, like, your projects, Steve, are kind of taking away this notion of a mainstream development company making heaps of money from land? But what are the ideas we have around community land trusts or other ownership of land to change the way land is viewed in our society and to have a localized housing? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question because, and this is one of the reasons why we're talking about rural land, not only in terms of that land value uplift, but to create a different dynamic in the financing structure and in the land ownership structures as well. So it's not about just the technical design. So the system of housing is not just about the built environment, it's about the system of ownership and the system of financing to get that end product. So what we're talking about is having a community land trust purchase the rural land at the outset, and any improvements remain with the community land trust that owns it in perpetuity. So the development process is one in which a community of people are building their house together, and we would be facilitating that process. And so, a lot of people, and one of the questions in the chat group is, we should be just retrofitting what's already there. Absolutely agree that we should be retrofitting what's there, but what is already there is has embedded within it ownership structures, competing stakeholders, a particular built environment already structured in a particular way. It doesn't allow us to completely reimagine our relationship with the land and with our community in that whole development process. And that's what we're trying to do by starting with rural land and reimagine the financing, the ownership, and the physical design in an integrated, systemic way. And then the lessons from that can be applied then later into the built environment. But the aim is to demonstrate that this will be way more affordable, regenerative in terms of its relationship with the land. So our daily economic activities of producing food and managing water will be regenerating natural systems, and have that connection between the collaborative arrangement between people and the relationship between the community and the land on which they're located. So, there's a lot of deconstructing that we need to do, and we can't do it by sitting in an existing built environment that's shaped by the old economic system. We need to kind of step out and reimagine the whole thing from scratch. So that's how I see it.
I don't do that very often now. I was talking to myself. I was on mute. I live on Zoom enough. I should know better. I was just going to say, Elena and Matt, did you want to respond in terms of, I completely agree with Steve that these creating alternatives and showing and inspiring people to see these other options are great, but I might start linking to people's questions. Ness commented on Matt's presentation about multi-unit dwellings being economical and sustainable. And this is not a conversation about one approach being better than the other. I think at the moment, as we transition to hopefully a better future, all of these options are happening right now and will continue. So Matt, particularly from your point of view, perhaps, or Elena, your ideas about current housing stock, how do we try to think about the ownership of multi-unit dwellings or the creation of them or the retrofitting of them in a way that localizes ownership or localizes those environmental impacts that Steve was talking about?
What's to cover there?
Pick anything you wish, or just ignore me and talk about the weather.
No, I'll jump into a couple of things that come to mind.
Yeah.
And I think the rule of thumb roughly is that the housing stock replenishes at about a rate of 1% a year. So that's sort of how quickly old things will get knocked down and new things rebuild, and sort of growth mixed into that as well, which means that 70% of the houses that we're going to be in 2050 already exist now. So retrofitting is a massive, like you have to think about that. You have to think about that in terms of meeting climate targets. You have to think about it about making homes comfortable and safe and healthy for people to live in, because the homes we have now are the homes we're stuck with. And I totally agree with Stephen's point about imagining and creating better options going forward, but we have to deal with what we've got as well, because that's a legacy we have. That's our legacy. So yes, I think really got to focus on that. And this is kind of a bit of a tangent, but I've spoken with companies more in the commercial office building space, and there are specific kind of building investment groups who specialize in finding the old crappy office buildings that they think they can turn from a old crappy office building that people pay minimal rent for because it's terrible, and with some, you know, a bit of thought and some judicious upgrades, make it into quite an attractive building to get tenants paying a lot more rent. And that's their sort of business model, and that's not widespread, but it definitely exists. And I think there's 100% of space for that in residential apartments as well, to say, well, we're clever, we can make this a much more comfortable apartment very, you know, fairly simply if we think about it. And kind of on that as well, there's some work that uni did on looking at ways you can make existing apartment buildings that are old potentially taller by using light gauge steel framing to add on extra floors in a way that isn't as heavy and kind of won't stress out buildings in the way that adding lots more bricks to floors would. There's kind of interesting ways to think about making more use and better use of the buildings you have.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Let's stay on this topic, but I just want to read the bottom part of Nessa's comment. Was a question there saying, an investment cooperative focused on buying and retrofitting existing unit blocks to rent affordably could fill a gap. What do you think? And it's the investment of these things that I find interesting, because if at the moment the entire marketplace is driven by these massive large corporations who have development interests, and your ordinary humans, even building a co-op, can't get enough money to buy things to do the good deeds, what are the solutions there? What are the responses? How do you get the co-ops and the investment and the money? Or am I thinking about it wrong? Tell me.
No, well, and it's interesting. The research project I'm working on at the moment is looking at how to co-housing groups get from we're keen and we want to do this to having a finished development, and what are the main barriers, even from a fairly kind of vanilla group buy with a developer involved process. And there's a lot of risk from a kind of the lenders who give out the money to finance that kind of thing, to having this group involved, because there's social dynamics of the group. They probably haven't done a large scale development before, so it's a riskier proposition. So there's particular barriers in that process around constructing something new with a kind of an inexperienced group. So actually thinking about buying something that already, like setting up the cooperative structure to buy something that's already there, takes out that particular risk that's a big barrier for co-housing groups in the process. So there's, I'm not sure how you, like, I think there's probably a way to make the business case to get the money together to do that, and maybe it needs some kind of help from social impact investors or sort of alternative routes to get all the money. But in some ways it makes more sense than trying to build something new from scratch as a group who's interested in collaborative, cooperative, localized housing options.
Yeah, I really think when you're talking about speculative land development, which is what most land development is, the people in finance price in the risk. And so a tier one developer actually issues their own bonds and gets their own investment at something like 4 or 5%. As you get less and less experience, people coming into the game, the interest rates are much higher. So a community would be looking at something like 15 to 20% interest on their development finance. I just found out recently, Nightingale, which is mentioned in one of the chats there, is they're Melbourne-based architects that essentially are trying to create a sort of a more collaborative development model that cuts out the developer profit, and they're getting their finance at 15%. So, and they're a group that have some development expertise. So I think, a community of people trying to finance their own development is always going to be on the back foot and more expensive than a developer doing it. You know, ideas in like Bauer Group, building collectives have, you know, and that's essentially, I guess, what Nightingale could be called, is possibly one way of doing it. But another way is to look at financing completely differently, and think of it in terms of what's called fractional real estate investment, which there's only one company that I know of that does it, but essentially it's a platform. So they have the financial license, and you upload a project or a property on their website, and they set up a managed fund because they have the financial license, and people can buy shares or units in that property or in that development. And that's a way of getting the finance potentially at a lower price by everyone buying in, by getting a whole lot of people to buy in. And that way you're not getting debt finance. People are just buying shares in the property. And once you have enough people, then you can, you know, you build the development.
Mm. I'm just going through some of the other questions. So there's been a number of questions about, you know, what might the mix be for greenfield or rural development versus urban density and things like that. I'm not sure if anyone has a crystal ball, or a magic ball to mention what you think the future looks like in terms of where houses and density might be, or will it be more of the same with efforts to tweak the edges? And then I've got a couple more questions to come to, but what's your thought on the mix of housing as we move forward?
Okay, so I definitely have a view on that. The housing market now is primarily driven by or powered by new migrants coming in. So we have this year, apparently there's going to be 400,000 people coming in, which is catching up from, you know, the shorter supply over the COVID years. But our long-term average over the last 20 years is 300,000 odd, in that sort of 250 to 300,000 range. So all these new people coming in, and our desire, I guess, to put everyone into existing cities is one of the things that's driving up the prices. And if we could house new migrants, you know, in rural towns across the country in a much more distributed way, there would be much less pressure on urban house prices. So my view is that, as I said in the presentation, we need to distribute populations, particularly new migrant intakes, and that doesn't have to be, you know, you're forcing new migrants to go out into rural areas, but you're developing rural areas and allowing, if people from the cities want to move to the regions, and there is currently a net outflow from the cities to the regions. So all the growth in the cities is powered by new migrants coming in from overseas. If we focus much more on settlements outside of the major cities, that would actually alleviate house prices in the urban areas. And one question was, what would that mean for urban areas? Well, house prices would fall if there's less demand for housing in the urban areas.
Thanks, Steve. There's a lot of questions here about collaborative and co-housing, and I just want to read out the question or the comment from Maggie Shambrook. Hello, Maggie. What are your thoughts about a campaign to engage the local, state and federal governments to give recognition and resources to scalable and replicable collaborative housing typologies across Australia? So mixed tenure, inclusive of shared equity, and an integrative system, as Steve has articulated. The Housing Older Women, after their analysis of the housing system, have come to a conclusion that it's a strategy that needs to be pursued. Elena, did you want to respond? And you're on mute. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment we're in a kind of challenging situation where we're so far behind in the provision of social and affordable housing that the focus is in that sort of really crisis place, and the interest is really just around churning out more super affordable housing via the government and the community housing providers. Now, that's great. Of course, we need to do that. But leaves a sort of massive hole, key worker space. And it means that the focus is kind of the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff with no one building a fence at the top, So we do really need to get them to engage across the spectrum. I often talk about the housing spectrum, then is the market, and 4% is the social housing sector, and there's really not a lot else in terms of meaningful work in pursuing innovation like cooperatives as a true third sector housing option, or like community land trusts to divorce the housing from the land. I think we do need a really concerted effort around engaging on those issues, but it's really hard for government to be seen to be providing financial support to anyone other than those that are sort of the most needy. And the problem there is that the levers that they have to pull are all in a kind of tax space, and it's really a political kind of football at the moment. I mean, I think I would also add that part of the problem in transitioning from the private ownership model to the co-op CLT model is in part an issue around flexibility, that you can't just build one and people move in and live there, because if they do have to move for work or family or whatever, there isn't somewhere else to move. So that's a disincentive. It kind of incentivizes people to retain that individualistic ownership capacity. And the other thing is that housing is deeply, deeply tied to retirement and people's individual responsibility around kind of providing for their own financial kind of security when they can't work anymore, and also around their kind of intergenerational obligations to provide a foundation for any children or family that they have. And neither of those things can really be considered selfish, because in part a lot of that narrative is around not being a burden on society. But if we changed the housing conversation, then it wouldn't be about people being a burden. It would be about providing all people with the basic needs of life and human existence. And that's a totally different conversation.
Well put, Elena.
Thank you. So look, there are other questions that connect around the question of what do we do about the idea that certain towns are already only building inside their town footprint. Yes, we need to go into rural areas. And then another set of questions and comments around, well, actually housing needs, and Tracy, I'm reading from yours for this one, housing needs to be located where there's employment or where employment can be created. Also need to protect rural land for food growing, biodiversity and catchment care. So decentralized housing needs to be clustered to take that into account, etc. Steve, I know that the work you're doing has absolutely factored in those environmental issues, but what would you say to people who say, we need all the rural land we can get, we don't need to build out there, we must have only urban density, yes, that's the word.
Yeah, because the thought is, and it's mentioned here, we need to protect rural land for food growing. But much if you actually go and have a look at some of that rural land and drive for kilometres and kilometres of cleared what was previously forests is now grazing land with maybe 2 or 3 cows on it. It's not used for agriculture. It's protected for agricultural uses, but agriculture is no longer viable in a lot of these areas up and down, particularly the hinterland of the whole sort of mountain range up, Great Dividing Range up and down the coast. The land parcels are quite small. The farmers are aging. Their children don't want to take on agriculture because it's not viable. So they've moved to the cities, and we've got an aging population of farmers who are just hanging onto the land, hoping, for some sort of transition plan that for many doesn't exist. And what we're talking about is creating, food forests, food production activity in connection with the housing and regenerating those natural systems. So to the point of creating work opportunities, there certainly are work opportunities there. It may not be an office job for a lot of people, but some people can work remotely. But the question is, when we talk about creating jobs, we're creating jobs so that people can pay for a house and put food on the table. So if you create a local economy in which people are housed and have access to food, then you're taking out the middleman. You're taking out all that kind of global supply chains to deliver food and the complex systems of delivering housing. You create a local economy that serves as that social foundation for the people living within it, in order for them to engage in other economic activities if they wish to, or rest and recreation and community connection and other things that are more important than jobs and growth.
And I might just add quickly that the right way to create a environmentally, socially sustainable town or city is going to be different in different places, depending on what the land, fertility is like, what the existing uses are, what the cities are like, what you can, like in some places it is that sort of medium density European city style 15-minute city that might be the most appropriate option, but in other places it's different, and it's more of the kind of decentralized community, and there's no one size fits all in this.
That's right, Matt. And look, as someone whose main hat that she wears during the days with the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and we're passionate about bioregional or catchment connected governance of human societies, it is those unique places that matter. Some areas might be a desert that you cannot put people into beyond a certain number because it simply cannot provide the water and the support for those humans. So we have to be very realistic in Australia, one of the driest or the driest continent on Earth, about where we can put people, how we can use resources, what the cities are drawing from those neighbouring areas. But yeah, I think Steve's point about and this is something we do in our Green Prints program, is we actually show people for their region or bioregion how it used to be. What did the cover and the vegetation used to look like? And how do we have a transition plan that is unique to that place? Whether it's housing, whether it's energy, whether it's food, how do we make sure that the living world of this unique place can be sustained as our foundation and for its own moral right to exist? And we can't just think about cookie cutter approaches to anything humans do. So I think that's a really nice thing to connect to some of that deeper thinking. But at the same time, there's also those practical issues of how the heck do we help people right here, right now, who are really struggling. So, and although this was advertised to finish at 1:30, I do apologise. It has to finish at 1:20, our session today, because We're a humble network run by volunteers, and we've only got one Zoom link, and it's needed for another session for another group at 1:20. So one thing I wanted to bring us back to, perhaps before we start to wrap up, and there's some lovely comments coming in there. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so kind. What do you think are some of the things people can do right now if folks are concerned? I know a number of folks on this call are already heavily involved in housing issues. They've got their own body of work, but what can people do to connect with each other? Or if you're like me and you've not got a housing background, but are really passionate about it, because I've seen other people and myself at times in my life suffer from nowhere to live or fear, a deep fear of homelessness. So what do you reckon are some of the things people can do right now? Elena, I'm going to jump to you. Lucky you, springing this big question on you.
Well, I mean, I think as a start, you can get to know your neighbours. That's really important. And I mean, one kind of story that I heard was someone who would go down and ask their kind of much poorer neighbour if they could borrow sugar, because they knew it was something that family would be able to afford to do. But what it meant was that it opened the door that family could ask for something in return, rather than it seeming like a burden or an imposition. So I think as much as possible, start to try and cultivate those relationships of sharing, find things that you can offer and things that you can ask for that normalizes that in your local community. And then those opportunities for interaction can kind of lead to greater and greater forms of building social capital and that kind of care for people and country that we need if we're going to start to have some of these really big conversations.
That's wonderful, Elena, as always, compassionate and kind. And let's face it, one of the most confronting things your average Westerner might do is talk to their neighbours. It's quite frightening to think about talking to strangers, and it's a big deal. And I always like how in your talks, Elena, you remind us that a lot of our culture has forgotten some of, or perhaps never been taught about some of these collaborative community relationship building ways of doing. And I don't mean everyone on this call, you're probably all doing fabulously, but I know myself and from other experiences, it's something that's being forgotten in our Western culture. But things we can do right here, right now. Steve, Matt, who wants to jump in next? It could be anything. Lobby your government, stake out the federal MP's office and tell them that they're killing koalas, whatever you think. Steve?
I would say Elena covered off on those much more immediate things. I just think we should not lose sight of, the long-term changes that are necessary, and be planning and working towards those as well. Because if we just allow kind of the economic beast to keep going in the direction that it's going, and all we're doing is retrofitting and trying to kind of massage it after it's done into something that works for people, then it's like kind of the tail wagging the dog. We need to grab it from the horns, right? And change.
The dog has horns. Yes, absolutely.
Well, whatever it is.
No, I'm joking.
Yeah, so from the head. So we really need to think of those longer term, more strategic things. And I appreciate that, I've come from a position of relative privilege and can focus on that, and other people have more pressing issues and need those immediate solutions. But I would just say we need to be thinking of of all
Absolutely.
of those.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, Steve. And I think the work that many of us do is about this immediate stuff, but also that bigger picture of how do we move towards something better. And even if we're only dealing with one aspect of that work, by coming together, we do sort of make that better community response, because we have some people thinking about those future developments and others thinking about how do we help people tomorrow. So yeah, Matt, final comments?
I think most of it has been said really well. I would encourage everyone to create a housing cooperative that goes and buys apartment blocks and retrofits them sustainably. That's a great step. And maybe just, I completely agree with Elena that doing what you can do where you are right now is a great thing to do, as well as getting the people whose job it is to make the laws that govern the way the country we live in, telling them what you think and lobbying them to change things, both really important. And just one of my favorite pieces of research ever, I think, was seeing that the thing that was most likely to influence somebody in our street to install solar panels on their roof was whether their neighbours had solar panels on the roof, because what you can see and what you can be told about at the barbecue when you're catching up or whatever is such a big influence on what you do. So the things that you do in your own space and can show to your neighbours and talk to your neighbours about can have a really big influence.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, ladies and gentlefolk, Eleanor's written, you can't be what you can't see. That's exactly right. And that fits with what Steve's doing, with what you're all doing, showing these better alternatives and showing ways that we can do stuff. It's so important. So look, just going to start wrapping up now. And I really want to thank our three speakers, just amazing thinkers and experts in their own field, but to be constantly dragged into the NENA network and sharing their ideas it's really valued by everybody in NENA. And I hope everyone in the audience today too. I apologize. I feel like I'm a walking commercial for the New Economy Network, but it's part of my job, which is Fired by Love. The main website is neweconomy.org.au. And I just wanted to tell you that our localization week finishes up tomorrow with a wonderful session featuring Mary Graham, Indigenous elder, philosopher, and remarkable thinker on governance issues. She and I are going to be in discussion about what could governance systems look like to better build localization in Australia. And of course, she's drawing from the ancient wisdom of one of the oldest continuous cultures on earth. And she and I are working on a book together about the relationist ethos and what Australia could look like if it was the foundation of our society as a philosophy. In the meantime, what I'm showing you is that the recordings from the sessions earlier this week, some of them are already up. You'll see the first two there. Food was yesterday, housing today, and the discussion with the always fabulous Mary Graham tomorrow. Other than that, I also wanted to plug, please think about coming to the NENA conference showing, no, I've got my arrows wrong. Yep. Life After Capitalism, a beautiful gathering of all the humans connected to NENA in Canberra in November. All the info is on the website. On that note, so I think my head is in the front of the dates. I might change the doobie. So 17th to the 19th of November in Canberra. We know that traveling can be challenging for folks. We're now only holding NENA conferences every 2 years to sort of justify if people do want to trek down. And we've been really great at having our conferences in different places. 2017 was Brisbane, 2018 was Melbourne. We've been to Perth. Then there was COVID. So they've been online. So it'd be a great chance to come back together and chat. And, you know, it is Canberra. So if you're down there lobbying the federal government for any reason whatsoever, time it to come to our conference as well. It's going to be fun. But that's enough of Michelle Maloney walking advertisement for the New Economy. Oh, I also want to mention someone in the comments, thank you so much, said, I think donut economics is a great model. We agree, brilliant approach to thinking about economics. You also mentioned that the Welsh government created a commission for future generations. Can I plug the fact that I was lucky enough to interview and be in conversation with the outgoing commissioner for future generations? And that webinar, that conversation is also on the NENA events page. And it really is one of the most inspiring conversations I've had in a long time, where they talk about how embedding decision-making practices that have to reflect good things for people today and into the future has just started to change some of their systems. Alrighty, enough from me. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Do connect with NENA, check out cohousing, support Steve when he comes to town in his van, telling folks that here's an awesome way to build communities. And thank you so much for your support, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye.